All right, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Allison, and I am delighted to be able to bring you another STLZOOM webinar. I'd like to go over a few things before we start talking about today's topic of backyard biodiversity. I have a few moderators helping me out behind the scenes, Connor and Kim. And Connor, if you could go ahead and pull up those community standard guidelines. We'll go over those before we dive into the topic at hand. So just wanted to review our community learning standards. Remind everyone to be friendly and respectful of others while we are interacting in the chat box. And that we will use the Q&A box. If you have not found those two functions on Zoom yet, they're either at the bottom or the top of your screen. But make sure that we are using those boxes and areas for appropriate and relevant questions. Make sure that we are responding and interacting in the chat box in regards to today's webinar so that we stay on topic. That'll help me and that'll help our fellow participants and moderators. And then also if our behavior in the chat or the Q&A is asked to be altered, maybe we're not being so respectful, my moderators will handle that for me behind the scenes. Okay, so let's go ahead and do the next one. Before we get started, if you've been with us for a few of these before, this will start to sound a little bit familiar. But if you have not already, please go ahead and open up that chat and type in your location, where you're zooming in from today, and how many are watching with you. We love to see where our audience and our community is interacting with us from. If you have a question during today's webinar, please put it in the Q&A rather than the chat box. If you put it in the chat, there's a good chance I will miss it. So drop it in the Q&A so that I can see it. We do have, like I mentioned, our moderators behind the scenes, and they will be helping out and monitoring the chat. And sometimes they put some information in the chat for you to look at as well. And then at the very end of today's webinar, there will be an enjoyment poll because we love doing these and we want to know how you guys are enjoying these as well. All right, so with that, biodiversity. Right? Biodiversity is something that is near and dear to my heart, in particular as a zoo educator, and it's something that we think a lot about at the zoo. So biodiversity is how we can measure the health and the quality of some different kinds of habitats. And in today's webinar, we're going to do a little bit of a crash course of really diving into what biodiversity is and some of the different layers of biodiversity. And then we will end up with learning how to assess the biodiversity of a particular habitat, how to figure out if a habitat is biodiverse. And I'm going to give you some tools so that you can do this in your own backyard. So I'm going to start sharing a PowerPoint so that you can see some pictures and a little bit of verbiage that we'll be talking about today. Sometimes it's easier to see it rather than to just listening to me talk about it. But go ahead and let's get ready. Here we go. I am so delighted to be able to talk about this today. It's one of my favorite things. Okay, so here we go. We'll start out with simply, what is biodiversity? And you may already have an idea in your head, and that's okay. But simply it is the variety of life in the world or in a particular habitat or ecosystem. So if we were to look up the definition in a dictionary or maybe a science textbook, it would be pretty close to this one. And how we can think about biodiversity, we can think of it in like 3 different layers. So we'll start with the largest layer first, and that is ecosystem or habitat diversity. And what we mean by thinking about ecosystem or habitat diversity, it's just the diversity of the different kinds of ecosystems and habitats. So we could imagine thinking about biodiversity for the state of Missouri, where the St. Louis Zoo is located. So how many different kinds of habitats are located within the state of Missouri? We could expand it out to how many different kinds of habitats are on our home continent of North America. Or we could even think about the biomes of the world. So we can think about this globally. So ecosystem and habitat diversity, we're going way big picture with this. All right. Our next little layer down is species diversity. And this just means the different kinds of species in a particular habitat. So let's keep thinking about the state of Missouri. If we were to study the species diversity of a forest, we could go out and collect in different methods, which we'll go over today, what kinds of animals and plants live in that habitat. Right? And then if we really shrink it down, this is our lowest level of biodiversity, we're looking at genetic diversity. So DNA, right? Everything that makes us us, and that cardinal, or that squirrel, that particular squirrel. So we want to see how well represented certain genes are in a population, if there's a wide variety of genes in a population, or maybe there's not a huge variety of genes in a population. And by looking at that, we can tell if maybe a population of lizards has been isolated. It's like they've been on their own little island for a while, and they may be the same species, but they're just a little bit different than a similar species over here, that sort of thing. So I hope that makes sense to you all. We're going to go through some of these things kind of quickly, just because of the nature of the time that we have. But if you have any questions, or you want to know more about a certain topic and I went through it a little bit fast, these will be recorded and you can watch them again later. All right, so that's kind of our crash course in biodiversity. And for the rest of the webinar today, we're going to be thinking of biodiversity in terms of species diversity. So the variety of different animals and plants that live within a different kind of habitat, and how we measure that. Now, what's really cool is that we're doing a biodiversity study at the St. Louis Zoo. We're doing one, but there's always a reason why we want to study biodiversity. So after I go through these 6 statements here, I'm going to have Connor pull up a poll, because I want to know, why do you think biodiversity is important? Why is it important to have a nice variety of plants and animals? So I'm going to read these off real quick, and then you're going to tell me which one you think is most important. All right, so our first one is, it is important to conserve the diversity of life for medical and economic reasons. Plants and animals could provide us with additional foods, medicines, and other products that will save lives and benefit society. So that's position 1. Position 2, it is important to protect the diversity of life because biodiversity helps maintain important ecological processes such as oxygen production, pollination, and flood control that, in turn, help support all life on Earth. Number 3, our lives would not be as rich if we lost species such as bears, beetles, hawks, frogs, lizards, and tigers, and the habitats where they live. The rich diversity of life also allows for important recreational activities such as hiking, fishing, camping, and birding. Position 4, it is important to protect the diversity of life because no generation has the right to destroy the environment and resources on which future generations depend. It is our responsibility to take care of the diversity of life. Position 5, it is important to protect the diversity of life because biodiversity provides inspiration and provokes curiosity and imagination. Art, music, and poetry are often inspired by the diversity of life. And many of our technological advances, such as flight, have been inspired by examples of nature. And our last position, it is important to conserve the diversity of life because all species have a right to exist. So marinate on that really quick. Which one of these 6 do you think, you personally think, is why it is important to conserve biodiversity? And I'd like to know in our poll. So, and it is important to remember that there is no one right answer with this. This is your opinion, excuse me, your own motivation for why you think saving biodiversity, conserving biodiversity is important. I'll leave the poll up for just a moment so you can take a look at those positions, roll it around in your brain. And we'll do maybe about 7 more seconds thinking about this. All right, and 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. Let's go ahead and close the poll. All right, yeah, so we have a lot of different opinions out there, and that's okay, but it seems like a majority of you have picked position 6. Yeah, so it is important to conserve the diversity of life because they all have a right to exist. Yeah. All right, and like I said, there is no one correct answer. This is just what you feel in your heart. All right, so now, like I said, what's really cool is that at the St. Louis Zoo, we are doing a biodiversity study, and we're measuring it in some different ways. So I pulled up a map here so that you can see where the St. Louis Zoo is. It's that little pin that is dropped with the paw print. That is where we are located in Forest Park. And this is the zoo that people have been coming to for over 100 years in St. Louis. Now, our gold star up by the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri River is our new North Campus. So we just purchased this property with help of some funds, and we want to know what kinds of animals are living there, because there's not a zoo there, right? We don't have anything really built there yet, but we want to know what animals are living in this space, how are they using this space, and maybe even what kinds of animals are migrating through this space. So we're going to look at 3 ways that we're studying that. Our first way is with this device. It doesn't look like much, but this is a recording device to track bats. This can pick up those high frequencies that bats use when they echolocate so that we know if they're flying around. So that's one way we can track some animals. Another way is by a different kind of recording device. This little thing right here in this bag is called an audio moth. And we're using this to record the different sounds of frogs and toads that may live in the area. And what's really neat is that if you have a trained ear, you can listen and figure out which different frog and toad species are calling. And if you're really, really good, you may even be able to determine how many are calling. And if that's something that interests you, we do have a recorded webinar from a few weeks ago that teaches you all about that. We'll help you identify some common frog and toad calls around St. Louis. So you can be like one of our St. Louis Zoo researchers. So, and our last way is that sometimes we might collect animals and measure them and assess them. So this is one of our zoo researchers. She has captured a non-venomous black rat snake, and she's measuring it, weighing it, getting an idea of what its body condition is like, recording all of that information, and then placing it back in the habitat in the wild. Because by doing some of these measurements, that can give us an idea of how healthy these animals are. And one of the other ways, I don't have a picture we're using to assess biodiversity on our new North Campus property, is we're using camera traps or field cams. If you have a family who's a hunter, they may put out field cams in a spot where they would like to hunt, and it's just motion triggered. So if an animal walks past the camera, it'll take a series of pictures. And so far, we've seen pictures, lots of pictures of deer, turkeys, and coyote. And if you go back and check on our social media page or our blog on STLZOO.org, you can see some of those pictures of the animals that we've captured on the camera trap. So there's lots of ways that we can do this, but we're going to focus on one way that you can do this in your backyard. All right, so you're going to see me again, nice and big here. And I want to talk to you about how we can do something called a quadrant study or a point study. But before we do that, it's always a good idea for scientists to think about, make a prediction. right? So if we're studying the biodiversity in our own space, and maybe it's our backyard, maybe it's a park near our house, maybe it's a courtyard, maybe it's an empty lot, I'm going to have Connor share another poll and ask you, just right off the bat, just thinking, if you had to guess, do you think your area is very biodiverse? Your green space that you might want to investigate? Do you consider it to be a biodiverse space? Is there a large variety of plants and animals in that space? Well, we'll find out for sure. We'll get some tools. Yeah, it can be kind of an interesting thing to think about, especially if you have an inquisitive scientific mind. All right, let's go ahead and end that poll. So yeah, so a lot of you are like, yeah, I do consider my outside space biodiverse, and that's great. But we're going to, like I said, figure out a way where we can measure that, because scientists, we like data, and we like data to support what we think or maybe disprove. Okay, so like I said, one way we can do this is by using something called a quadrat or a point study. And what that just means is you need a frame. You need a box. So this would be an example of something like a quadrat. I really am just using a picture frame. And when you do this, you would take your frame, find a study spot in your backyard or your green space, place it on the ground, and everything that falls within this space, you record. So maybe you're really interested in what is living out there. So you've brought some field guides with you. So you figure out what kinds of plants are within this little space. Maybe you have some invertebrates that are within here as well. Record those. If you don't have time to look it up in the moment, snap a picture, right? We all have this great technology that we carry around in our pockets a lot of the time. In this kind of study, if something flies over this space while you're recording, you count that too. So if there's that robin that went right over the spot, you record the robin. Or maybe a younger sibling is being a younger sibling and hops over it, you record them as well. Now, when I did a study like this in college, our frames were much larger than this, maybe a couple meters by a couple meters, because you want to try to collect as much data as you can. And we even did a really measured kind of study where we plotted out on like a grid in our habitat, where we would go and place these down at certain intervals. In your backyard, you don't have to do that unless you really want to. Some people might, I don't know. I probably would, because I'm just that kind of a person. But then once you have all of that data collected, you can plug it into a formula and assign a number to it. That's right. I said formula. We're going to do just a smidgen of statistics today. Don't run away. I promise. It's fun. It'll be really easy. I'll walk you through how to do it. And then there will also be a PDF posted on the website after this webinar to help you walk through the steps. And of course, this will be recorded, so watch it again. All right, so here's our example. Right now, I unfortunately did not have the time to go out in my backyard and record all my biodiversity, but I do have a model that will help us walk through this process. So we're going to pretend that within this cube is all of the different kinds of species that I found within my little quadrat here, and I collected it. So I assigned a species name to those things, I counted the individuals, and I wrote it down on a data table. Ha-ha, you'll get one of these too. So for species names, right, scientists like to name things pretty much the way they look. So I have, for example, some green paper grass, white paper grass, blue pom-poms, and recorded the number of each of those individuals there. So for instance, if you're doing this in your backyard and you flip over a log and you see a lot of roly-polies, you would write down roly-polies and like 20, right? However many there are. So then we're going to take that data and put it into this right here. This is our mathematical formula. Like I said, don't run away, don't be scared. Math is not something that comes very easy to me personally, and I think this is a really beautiful equation. So this is called the Simpson's Diversity Index. So what we're solving for is this variable right here, D, and that's the Simpson's Diversity Index. And our data table is going to be set up so that all we have to do is plug in numbers to our variables here. All right, so there's that Simpson's Diversity Index. So on my table, I have a spot at the bottom where I've recorded some of those numbers. So in our formula, we will need to have a number represent our small n, which is the number of individuals. So the total number of things that you found, and that's plants and animals. And then we'll also need a big N, okay, which is really the huge total. And then we'll need n minus 1 is one of our variables that we'll need to put in. So we're just taking this number minus 1, plug it in here. And then we need to multiply those two numbers together, which ends up being in this column. So once we have all of that figured out, and I have some notes for myself down here, my big N, my total number of individuals in the box was 66. And then we need to take the sum of everything that we've multiplied, and that's down here. Not too scary, right? Not too scary. So here we are again. So here's our formula with our numbers filled in. I'm gonna try to, oops. I have my camera mirrored so that you're looking at this the correct way. I have to flip my brain backwards a little bit. So I've just plugged in my numbers. So our top here, which was our sum of our multiplication, was 954. And then we saw 66 individuals in that frame. So I wrote that 66, and then eventually we will need to multiply that minus 1 as well. So here we go. So now we have 954, and we'll divide that by 66 times 65. That's that n minus 1. And we will get this. So 954 divided by 4,290. Okay. And we end up with that. So now we have our Simpson's Diversity Index equals 1 minus 0.22, which eventually leaves us with our answer of 0.78. So that's our Simpson's Diversity Index. But what does that tell us? That's just a number, 0.78. I don't know. Well, what that tells us is that this habitat is actually pretty biodiverse. With the Simpson's Diversity Index, your answer will always be between 0 and 1. If you get a number outside of that, go back and check your math. But essentially what we will learn is that if that number that you get for your Simpson's Diversity Index, the closer it is to 1, the more diverse your habitat. So if you go out in your backyard and do this in a couple of different places, you can even show that, like, okay, maybe this corner, not so biodiverse. There's, maybe just grass here, or just violets, or, ooh, in my pollinator garden that I planted, wow, look at how diverse it is. I've got this number to prove it, to show it. So that, I think, is really, really exciting. So we're going to wrap up our webinar. I've got one more thing to show you, and as to why maybe we want to study biodiversity, and all of this is really, really important. So let's go back to my PowerPoint. Let's go screen, there we go. And that is because animals can be indicators of habitat health. So another study that the St. Louis Zoo is doing is taking place right in our backyard in Forest Park. We've started studying the aquatic turtles of Forest Park. And we're taking health assessments of these turtles. So our researchers will go out with hoop nets, scoop these little guys up. We'll take some health measurements, so measure how big they are, how heavy they weigh, and then take some samples too. We might swab their little noses to see if they're carrying any kind of illnesses, like maybe some viruses or bacteria that could potentially make other species sick. because what's really nice is that we know that a biodiverse habitat has the habitat itself is healthy, the animals are healthy, and then the people that live around that habitat are healthy. So all of these studies working together can give us a lot of great information. So I know that was a lot in a very short amount of time, but I think we can do it. So I see I've got some questions, and I'm going to answer a few questions, and then we'll be done for the morning. Sound good? Let's see what kinds of questions we have. Okay, so let's see here. Ooh, that's a good question. So can the recording device, can it tell what types of bats? You know what, I'm not sure if the recording device itself can. Our scientists and researchers, you know, if you go in having a good idea of what species occur naturally in that habitat, you know, you can get a pretty good idea maybe of what is flying around. So, and it could also depend on the time of year. So there are some other variables that you might know going into it ahead of time that can help you assess what types of bats are flying around. Good question, good question. All right, any particular size for the frames? Yeah, so these quadrats, if you are doing this like for real, I would say bigger, better. If you really want to get a good sense of what your data is. For home enjoyment purposes, I would say something like a picture frame would be just fine, especially if you're practicing identifying some of the different species in your yard. So, okay, let's see, what else do we have here? Ooh, I like this question. How did you get interested in biodiversity? Man, that is a really good question. What interests me mostly is just all of the different kinds of things that you can learn from biodiversity. So like we looked in the beginning, it's a huge topic. You can think of it really, really big scale or really, really small scale. But for me, studying biodiversity and learning about biodiversity is really about just learning kind of the secrets of nature, how everything works together. I personally find that really, really fascinating. So how plants and animals can rely on each other in lots of different ways, how some of those really intricate mechanisms of nature work. All right, so friends, with that, I am so sorry we are out of time. If I did not get to your question, I apologize. If you have further questions relating to this webinar or about our animals at the zoo, we will have a email, that's what it is, that will pop up after this webinar is concluded. So with that, we have our last poll, and that is the enjoyment poll. So please be honest with that. We love to know what you guys are thinking. And if you would like to see more of webinars like this, please let us know as well. So thank you all for taking time out of your morning to spend that with me. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we hope to see you around at the zoo very soon. Bye-bye.